There are secrets that families bury so deep, they think no one will ever find them. But the truth has a way of clawing its way to the surface no matter how many people try to keep it hidden. For 12 years, I lived in a house where darkness masqueraded as normalcy, where the very people who should have protected me became my greatest threat. My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm 68 years old now, and I'm finally ready to tell you about the nightmare that nearly destroyed me and how my mother's discovery changed everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I was born in 1996 in Springfield, Missouri, to a single mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep us afloat. My biological father had left when I was 3. Not that I remembered him much. It was just me and Mom, Jessica Mitchell, in our small 2-bedroom apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery. The smell of fresh bread would wake me up every morning, and for the first 6 years of my life, that was enough. Mom was everything to me. My protector, my best friend, my whole world. Jessica worked as a night shift nurse at Springfield General Hospital and cleaned office buildings during the day. I barely saw her awake, but when I did, she made every moment count. She'd read me stories with funny voices, braid my hair while humming old songs, and always made sure I knew I was loved. We didn't have much money, but we had each other, and that felt like everything. When I was 7, everything changed. Mom started talking about a man she'd met at the hospital, Robert Henderson. He was a paramedic, she said, someone who saved lives and understood the demands of her job. At first I was curious. Mom would light up when she mentioned his name, something I hadn't seen since I was very little. She deserved happiness, I thought. She deserved someone who would take care of her the way she took care of everyone else. Robert was 42 when he entered our lives, a tall man with graying temples and hands that seemed too large for his body. He had this way of speaking that made everything sound important, even when he was just asking about the weather. Mom was completely enchanted by him. She'd spend hours getting ready for their dates, trying on different outfits and asking my opinion about her lipstick. I loved seeing her happy, so I always told her she looked beautiful. The first time I met Robert, he brought me a stuffed elephant from the hospital gift shop. It was purple with a big red bow, and I clutched it tight while he and Mom talked in the kitchen. He seemed nice enough. He asked about school, complimented my drawings on the refrigerator, and didn't seem annoyed when I interrupted their conversation. But there was something about the way he looked at our apartment, like he was taking inventory of everything we owned, that made me uncomfortable. "Sarah's a smart girl," he told my mother that night. "You've done a good job raising her on your own." The way he said "on your own" made it sound like Mom had been doing something wrong all these years, like she needed his approval to validate her parenting. But Mom just smiled and squeezed his hand, grateful for the compliment. Nita zeta 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 z. As the months passed, Robert became a fixture in our lives. He'd show up after Mom's day shifts with takeout food and stories from work. He fixed our leaky faucet, hung pictures that had been sitting in a closet for years, and gradually started leaving his things around our apartment. A spare uniform here, a coffee mug there, until it felt like he was already living with us before he officially moved in. You in a closet. I was 8 when Robert brought his son to meet us. Tyler Henderson was 13, with the same angular face as his father but darker hair and eyes that seemed to see everything. Robert explained that Tyler's mother had died in a car accident 2 years earlier, and that he and Tyler had been managing on their own ever since. The way he said it made it clear that our family was supposed to be the solution to their problems. Tyler was quiet during that first meeting, sitting on our couch with his hands folded in his lap while the adults talked. When Mom asked him about school, he answered in short sentences. When she offered him cookies, he declined politely. He seemed like a perfectly normal teenager, dealing with the awkwardness of meeting his father's new girlfriend and her daughter. I remember thinking he looked sad, and I felt sorry for him. I couldn't imagine losing my mother. Mom was determined to make Tyler feel welcome. She cleared out half of her craft room to make space for a bed and desk, bought new sheets with a pattern she thought a teenage boy might like, and stocked the kitchen with snacks she'd seen him eat. She wanted us to be a real family so badly that she threw herself into the role of stepmother with the same dedication she brought to everything else. Robert proposed 6 months later, on a rainy Thursday evening in November. Mom cried when she said yes, and I hugged them both because I thought that's what I was supposed to do. They seemed so happy, so sure that this was the right thing for all of us. Robert picked me up and spun me around, saying I was going to be his daughter now, that he was going to take care of both of us forever. The way he said forever should have been comforting, but something about it made my stomach twist. The wedding was small, just us, a few of Mom's friends from work, and Robert's brother who drove up from Kansas City. I was the flower girl, walking down the aisle of the little church in a yellow dress Mom had sewn herself. Tyler was Robert's best man, standing stiffly in a suit that was slightly too small for his growing frame. In the wedding photos, we looked like the perfect blended family. Mom radiant in her simple white dress, Robert proud and protective, Tyler trying to smile, and me clutching my bouquet of daisies with a gap-toothed grin. After the wedding, Robert and Tyler officially moved into our apartment, which suddenly felt much smaller with 4 people. Robert took over the master bedroom with Mom, Tyler got the converted craft room, and I kept my small bedroom at the end of the hall. The arrangement worked, mostly. Robert was handy around the house and helped with bills. Tyler was quiet and kept to himself, doing his homework at the kitchen table and disappearing into his room afterward. For a while things seemed normal. Robert would drive me to school in the mornings and Mom would pick me up in the afternoons when she wasn't working. Tyler largely ignored me, which I understood. I was just a little kid, and he was a teenager dealing with his own stuff. We'd eat dinner together most nights, with Robert telling stories from work and Mom asking about our days. It felt like what I imagined a real family was supposed to feel like. But families, I was learning, were complicated things. There were undercurrents I was too young to understand, tensions that existed in the spaces between words. Robert had strong opinions about how things should be done, how Mom should dress, how the house should be kept, how I should behave. He never yelled or got angry, but there was something in his tone when he made these suggestions that made Mom immediately agree, even when I could see she didn't really want to. Tyler, meanwhile, was struggling with the transition. He'd gone from being an only child to suddenly having a stepmother and stepsister. Sometimes I'd catch him staring at our family photos with an expression I couldn't read. When I tried to include him in games or asked about his friends, he'd give me short answers and find excuses to leave the room. Mom said he just needed time to adjust, that losing his mother had been hard and he was still healing. Cluix. I wanted so badly for us to be a happy family. I wanted Tyler to see me as a real sister, and I wanted Robert to love me the way I thought fathers were supposed to love their daughters. So I tried harder. I helped more around the house, I got better grades at school, I laughed at Robert's jokes even when I didn't understand them. I thought if I could just be good enough, perfect enough, everything would fall into place. No light. The first time something felt truly wrong was on a Saturday afternoon in the spring. Mom had been called in for an emergency shift at the hospital, and Robert was supposed to watch Tyler and me. But Robert got called out on an ambulance run, leaving Tyler in charge of babysitting me. I was 9 by then, old enough not to need constant supervision, but young enough that I couldn't be left completely alone. Tyler seemed annoyed by the responsibility. He was supposed to meet friends at the mall, but instead he was stuck at home with his little stepsister. I tried to stay out of his way, playing quietly in my room with my dolls and coloring books. But around lunchtime, I got hungry and ventured into the kitchen to make a sandwich. Tyler was there, leaning against the counter with a look on his face I'd never seen before. It wasn't the usual indifference or mild irritation. It was something darker, more calculating. When he saw me, he didn't move away from the refrigerator. "What do you want?" he asked, but not in the normal, annoyed big brother way. There was something else in his voice, something that made me hesitate in the doorway. "I just wanted to make lunch," I said quietly, hoping he'd move so I could get to the bread and peanut butter. Instead of stepping aside, Tyler moved closer. "You know, Sarah," he said, and the way he said my name made my skin crawl, "we're gonna be brother and sister for a long time." We should probably get to know each other better. I didn't understand what he meant then, but I knew I didn't like it. Something in his tone, in the way he was looking at me, set off alarm bells I was too young to fully comprehend. I mumbled something about not being hungry anymore and backed toward my room, but Tyler followed me. "Don't be like that," he said, reaching out to touch my arm. "I'm just trying to be friendly." I pulled away and ran to my room, locking the door behind me. I stayed there until I heard Robert's truck in the driveway, then emerged as if nothing had happened. Tyler acted completely normal when the adults returned, asking about their days and helping with dinner preparations. I convinced myself I had imagined the whole thing, that I was being silly and oversensitive, but I started to notice things after that. The way Tyler would find excuses to be in the same room as me when we were alone, the way he'd accidentally brush against me in the hallway, the way he'd offer to help me with homework when Robert wasn't around, sitting just a little too close and letting his hand linger when he pointed out mistakes on my paper. I was too young to have words for what was happening, too naive to understand that the uncomfortable feeling in my stomach was my instincts trying to protect me. All I knew was that something had changed in our house, and I was afraid to tell anyone because I wasn't sure what exactly there was to tell. The perfect family we'd tried so hard to create was beginning to crack, and I was the only one who seemed to notice. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The summer I turned 10, Robert decided our family needed a fresh start. The apartment above Mrs. Chen's bakery was too small for 4 people, he said, and a growing family deserved a real house. Mom was hesitant about the expense, but Robert had already found the perfect place. A 3-bedroom ranch house on Maple Street with a big backyard and a 2-car garage. It was in a nice neighborhood where kids rode bikes on sidewalks and families had barbecues on weekends. "Sarah will have her own bathroom," Robert told Mom as they looked over the real estate papers. "And Tyler can finally have some privacy. We'll be a real family and a real home." The way he emphasized real made it sound like everything we'd had before was somehow inadequate, temporary. Mom signed the lease that afternoon. Moving day felt like an adventure. I had my own room with windows that faced the backyard, and I could see other kids playing on swing sets and trampolines. Robert set up a basketball hoop in our driveway, and Tyler actually seemed excited about something for the first time since I'd known him. Mom was practically glowing as she arranged furniture and hung curtains, finally able to create the home she'd always dreamed of. But houses, I learned, can trap secrets just as easily as they shelter families. The new neighborhood meant new routines. Robert's work schedule was unpredictable. Sometimes he'd be gone for 12-hour shifts. Other times he'd have several days off in a row. Mom still worked her rotating schedule at the hospital, which meant there were more times when Tyler and I were left alone together, or when just Robert was home to watch me. At first, the extra space felt liberating. Tyler had his room at one end of the house, I had mine in the middle, and Robert and Mom's master bedroom was at the other end. There was a finished basement where Robert set up a workshop and Tyler was allowed to hang out with friends. The house felt big enough for all of us to coexist without constantly bumping into each other, but the new house also meant isolation. In the apartment, Mrs. Chen was always downstairs, and the thin walls meant our neighbors could hear everything. Here, our nearest neighbors were 50 feet away behind tall fences and mature trees. No one could see into our backyard, and no one could hear what happened inside our walls. The first incident in the new house happened on a Tuesday evening in late July. Mom was working a double shift, and Robert was supposedly at the fire station for training. Tyler was supposed to be in charge of me, which usually meant we'd order pizza and watch TV until bedtime. But instead of his usual indifference, Tyler seemed agitated, pacing around the living room and checking his phone constantly. "Where's Dad?" I asked, using the word Robert had encouraged me to call him, though it still felt strange on my tongue. "He's not coming home tonight," Tyler said, and there was something in his voice that made me look up from my coloring book. "He's staying at the station." I didn't think much of it. Robert sometimes had to work overnight shifts. But Tyler kept staring at me with that same calculating look I remembered from months earlier in our old apartment. This time, though, he didn't try to hide it. You know, Sarah, he said, sitting down on the couch next to me, closer than he normally would. We should probably start acting more like real brother and sister. I didn't understand what he meant. We do act like brother and sister, I said, focusing on staying inside the lines of my coloring page. Tyler laughed, but it wasn't a nice sound. No, we don't. We're too formal with each other. Real siblings are more comfortable together. He reached over and touched my hair, running his fingers through it in a way that made my scalp crawl. You have such pretty hair, Sarah, just like Mom's. I tried to scoot away, but Tyler's other hand landed on my shoulder, keeping me in place. Don't be shy, he said. We're family now. Family members can touch each other. Something about the way he said touch made every alarm bell in my head start ringing. I didn't have words for what was wrong about the situation, but my body knew. My heart started racing and my hands began to shake. I'm tired, I said, trying to stand up. I think I'll go to bed early. But Tyler's grip on my shoulder tightened. It's only 8 o'clock. Besides, I want to show you something first. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small digital camera, the kind that was becoming popular back then. Dad got this for me for my birthday. Want to see how it works? I shook my head, but Tyler was already turning it on, pointing it at me. Smile, little sister, he said, and the flash went off before I could protest. I blinked, seeing spots from the bright light. Tyler, stop, I said, trying to cover my face with my hands. Come on, just a few pictures? For the family album. He took another photo, then another. You know what would be really cute? If you took off your shirt. Like a little kid playing in the sprinkler. I froze. Even at 10 years old, I knew that was wrong. I knew that big brothers weren't supposed to ask little sisters to take their clothes off, especially not to take pictures. No, I said firmly, standing up despite his hand on my shoulder. I don't want to. Tyler's expression changed instantly. The fake friendliness disappeared, replaced by something cold and angry. You don't want to? He repeated. That's too bad, Sarah, because I'm in charge here. And if you don't do what I say, I'll tell Dad that you were being bad while he was gone, that you were disobedient and disrespectful. I stared at him, not understanding how the situation had shifted so quickly. I wasn't being bad, I whispered. That's not how I'll tell it, Tyler said, standing up so he towered over me. And who do you think Dad will believe? His real son? Or some kid he barely knows? The words hit me like a physical blow. Tyler was right. He was Robert's biological son, and I was just the extra kid who came with the marriage. If it came down to choosing sides, why would Robert choose me? Please don't tell him I was bad, I said, my voice getting smaller. I'll try to be better. Tyler smiled again, but it wasn't reassuring. I know you will, and being better means doing what your big brother tells you to do. Now, about those pictures. I don't know what would have happened next, because at that moment we heard Robert's truck in the driveway. Tyler immediately pocketed the camera and stepped away from me, his entire demeanor changing back to normal teenager mode. Hey, looks like Dad's home early, he said loudly, as if we'd just been having a casual conversation. I'll go help him bring his stuff in. Robert came through the front door, looking tired but happy to be home. How are my kids doing? He asked, ruffling Tyler's hair and giving me a quick hug. You two, getting along okay? Great, Tyler said before I could answer. Sarah and I were just talking about how we should spend more time together. Right, Sarah? I nodded numbly, not trusting my voice. Robert seemed pleased. That's wonderful. I was hoping you two would become closer. Family is the most important thing in the world. That night, I lay awake in my new room, staring at the ceiling and trying to make sense of what had happened. I knew Tyler had been trying to make me do something wrong, but I wasn't sure exactly what or why. I knew I felt scared and confused, but I didn't know who I could tell or if anyone would believe me. The worst part was Tyler's threat. What if I did tell, and Robert didn't believe me? What if he thought I was lying or causing trouble? Mom loved Robert so much, and she was so happy in our new house. What if telling the truth ruined everything for her? Over the next few weeks, Tyler's behavior became a pattern. Whenever we were alone, he'd make comments about my appearance, try to touch me inappropriately, or suggest games that made me uncomfortable. He was careful never to go too far when adults might return unexpectedly, but he was always pushing boundaries, always testing to see how much he could get away with. And then Robert started paying attention to me in ways that felt wrong too. It started with compliments that seemed innocent enough. "Sarah, you're getting so grown up," he'd say as I helped clear the dinner table. "You're going to be a beautiful woman someday, just like your mother." But the way he looked at me when he said it made my skin crawl. Then came the hugs that lasted too long, the hands that wandered to places they shouldn't touch, the accidental encounters when I was getting out of the shower or changing clothes. Robert was much more subtle than Tyler, much more careful, but the intent was becoming clear. I started to realize that both of them were watching me, studying me, coordinating their efforts in ways that were too deliberate to be coincidental. When Tyler pushed too hard and I got upset, Robert would swoop in to comfort me, positioning himself as the good guy while Tyler played the aggressive role. When Robert's attention made me uncomfortable, Tyler would distract me with threats or demands for secrecy. They were working together, I realized, with growing horror. This wasn't two separate problems. It was one coordinated assault on a 10-year-old girl who had nowhere to run and no one to tell. The house that was supposed to give us room to be a happy family had become a prison where I was constantly watched, constantly threatened, constantly afraid. And the worst part was that Mom still saw nothing but the perfect family she'd always wanted. I was learning that monsters don't always look like monsters from the outside. Sometimes they look like the men who fix your bike and help with homework, and tell your mother how lucky she is to have such a sweet daughter. Sometimes they look exactly like family. By the time I turned 11, I had learned to live in a constant state of hypervigilance. Every sound in the house, every footstep, every door opening or closing became a potential threat assessment. I developed an internal radar that could track where both Robert and Tyler were at any given moment, calculating my safety based on their proximity to each other and to me. School became my sanctuary, the only place where I could breathe without constantly looking over my shoulder. Mrs. Davidson, my 5th-grade teacher, started to notice changes in my behavior. I had gone from a chatty, outgoing student to someone who flinched at sudden movements and rarely spoke unless directly asked a question. "Sarah seems more withdrawn this year," she mentioned to Mom during a parent-teacher conference. "Is everything okay at home?" Sometimes when children go through big changes like moving or gaining new family members, they need extra support. Mom assured her that everything was fine. "Sarah's just adjusting to having a big brother," she explained. "It's been wonderful for her to finally have a father figure in her life. Robert is so good with her. He's really taken her under his wing." If only Mrs. Davidson knew how true that was, and how terrifying those wings had become. The abuse had evolved beyond inappropriate touching and uncomfortable conversations. Robert and Tyler had developed what I now understand was a sophisticated system of grooming and control. They never did anything when Mom was home, never left physical evidence, never crossed certain lines that might raise immediate red flags. But they pushed every other boundary with calculated precision. Robert had started giving me, quote, special privileges that isolated me further from any potential help. "Sarah's becoming such a mature young lady," he'd tell Mom. "I think she's ready for more grown-up responsibilities." These responsibilities included staying up late to help him with his paperwork after Mom went to bed, going on daddy-daughter errands when Tyler was at friends' houses, and receiving, quote, private talks about becoming a woman. During these sessions, Robert would speak to me in a voice that was gentle, but somehow more frightening than if he had yelled. He'd explain that our relationship was special, that not all stepfathers cared enough about their stepdaughters to take such a personal interest in their development. He'd tell me how proud Mom would be to know how mature and cooperative I was being. "Your mother works so hard, Sarah," he'd say, sitting too close to me on the couch in his workshop in the basement where no one could hear us. "The last thing she needs is to worry about problems at home. She needs to know that her daughter is happy and well cared for. You want Mom to be happy, don't you?" I always nodded, because of course I wanted Mom to be happy. That had been my whole world before Robert and Tyler came into it, making Mom proud, making her smile, being the daughter she deserved. "Good girls understand that some things are private family matters," Robert would continue, his hand resting on my knee in a way that made my skin crawl. "Good girls know that grown-ups sometimes have to teach them things that might feel uncomfortable at first. But that's how we learn to be mature women." The word women coming from his mouth when I was barely 11 years old made me want to disappear entirely. Tyler's approach was different but equally calculated. Where Robert used gentle manipulation and appeals to my love for Mom, Tyler relied on intimidation and the threat of exposure. He had taken more photos over the months, always when I was alone with him, always when I was scared or crying or trying to get away. He showed me some of them on his camera's small screen, and seeing myself looking frightened and vulnerable made me feel sick. "Look how scared you look," he'd taunt, scrolling through the images. "What do you think Mom and Dad would say if they saw these? They'd probably think you were being dramatic, making up stories. Kids who cry for no reason usually end up in special schools for troubled children." I didn't know if that was true, but Tyler said it with such confidence that I believed him. The threat of being sent away from Mom, even if home wasn't safe anymore, was worse than enduring whatever Tyler and Robert wanted from me. The most insidious part of their system was how they had begun to coordinate their efforts. If Robert spent an evening grooming me with his gentle manipulation, Tyler would follow up the next day with reminders about secrecy and threats about what would happen if I ever told anyone. If Tyler pushed too hard and left me visibly upset, Robert would appear with comfort and reassurance, positioning himself as my protector, while subtly reinforcing the message that this was normal family behavior. They had created a closed loop where every emotion I felt, every reaction I had, was anticipated and controlled. There was no escape route that they hadn't already blocked. The psychological torture was perhaps worse than the physical violations. They had made me complicit in my own abuse by convincing me that staying silent was the loving thing to do for Mom, the mature thing to do as a growing girl, the only thing to do if I wanted to remain part of the family. I started having nightmares, not just about what was happening to me, but about Mom finding out and hating me for it. In my dreams, she would look at me with disgust and disappointment, asking why I had let these things happen, why I hadn't been strong enough to stop them, why I had been so selfish as to allow our perfect family to be destroyed. My grades at school began to slip. I couldn't concentrate on math problems when my mind was constantly racing with fear. I couldn't focus on reading assignments when I was spending my mental energy on calculating whether it was safe to go to the bathroom between classes, or if I should wait until I got home. Even at school, even surrounded by teachers and other students, I felt exposed and vulnerable. Mrs. Davidson tried to reach out again. "Sarah, honey, you seem like you have something heavy on your mind. Is there anything you'd like to talk about? Sometimes it helps to share what's bothering us." I wanted so desperately to tell her everything. I wanted to grab her hands and pour out the whole horrible story about Robert's basement sessions and Tyler's photographs and the way they had turned my own love for my mother into a weapon against me. But Tyler's threats echoed in my ears, and Robert's gentle warnings about protecting Mom's happiness held me back. "I'm just tired," I told Mrs. Davidson. "Mom works a lot, and sometimes I don't sleep well." It wasn't entirely a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. And with each half-truth I told, each opportunity I let pass by to ask for help, I felt myself sinking deeper into a hole I might never be able to climb out of. At home, Mom remained oblivious to the nightmare happening under her own roof. She was so happy with our new life, so grateful for Robert's presence, so relieved to have financial stability and a complete family unit, that she saw only what she wanted to see. When she looked at Robert helping me with homework, she saw a devoted stepfather. When she saw Tyler and me in the same room, she saw siblings learning to get along. She never saw the way Robert's hands lingered when he hugged me goodbye in the mornings. She never noticed how Tyler's offers to help with chores always came with conditions that required us to be alone together. She never picked up on the way I had stopped laughing at dinner, stopped volunteering information about my day, stopped being the bubbly, talkative daughter I had been before. Or maybe she did see it, but interpreted it as normal growing pains. The natural result of an only child adjusting to suddenly having a father and brother, the expected awkwardness of a girl entering adolescence. The most heartbreaking part was that I still loved my mother desperately. Even as Robert and Tyler were systematically destroying my sense of safety and self-worth, even as they used my love for her as leverage to ensure my silence, I still wanted nothing more than to curl up in her arms and be protected the way I had been when I was little. But that little girl was disappearing more each day, replaced by someone who measured every word, calculated every movement, and carried secrets that felt too big for her small body to contain. I was learning that love could be twisted into something toxic, that family could become a trap, and that sometimes the people who promise to protect you become the very ones you need protection from. The worst part was beginning to believe that maybe I deserved it, that maybe good daughters accepted whatever their fathers and brothers wanted from them, that maybe this was just what growing up meant. I was 11 years old, and I was already forgetting what it felt like to feel safe. The winter I turned 12 marked the darkest period of my life. Snow had begun falling early that year, blanketing our neighborhood in a deceptive beauty that made everything look clean and peaceful from the outside. But inside our house on Maple Street, the walls seemed to be closing in tighter each day. Robert had been promoted to shift supervisor at the fire department, which meant more irregular hours and longer stretches when he was home during the day while Mom worked. Tyler, now 16, had gotten his driver's license and a part-time job at the local movie theater, which gave him a new level of independence and authority in the house. To anyone looking from the outside, our family appeared to be thriving. But I was drowning. The abuse had escalated beyond psychological manipulation and inappropriate touching. Both Robert and Tyler had become bolder, more demanding, more explicit in their expectations. The basement workshop had been soundproofed under the guise of Robert needing quiet space to work on his carpentry hobby. Tyler's room had been moved to the basement as well, giving him more privacy and putting him even further from Mom's awareness. The house's layout had been deliberately restructured to serve their purposes. Where once I felt like the distance between rooms provided some safety, now every space felt compromised. The basement was their territory. The garage was isolated. Even my own bedroom no longer felt secure, as both of them had found ways to bypass the simple lock on my door. What made everything worse was how normal they acted around Mom. During family dinners, Robert would tell stories about saving lives at work, and Tyler would share updates about school and his job. They'd ask about my day, help me with math homework, and joke around like any typical family. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could the same hands that violated me also help me tie my shoes? How could the same voices that whispered threats also sing happy birthday and tell bedtime stories? I began to dissociate during these family moments, watching our interactions as if I were floating above the table, observing strangers playing house. The Sarah who sat at dinner was different from the Sarah who existed in the basement or Tyler's room. I had learned to compartmentalize my trauma so completely that sometimes I almost believed the normal family moments were real. But the other Sarah, the one who lived in fear, was becoming harder to contain. I started exhibiting behaviors that should have been red flags to any observant adult. I stopped eating regularly, claiming I wasn't hungry or that my stomach hurt. I began having violent nightmares that left me screaming in my sleep, though when Mom asked about them, I always said I couldn't remember what they were about. I developed nervous habits, picking at my skin until it bled, pulling out eyelashes, biting my nails down to the quick. At school, my behavior became increasingly erratic. I had panic attacks in the bathroom, hyperventilated during fire drills, and couldn't handle being touched by classmates during group activities. Mrs. Davidson had been replaced by a younger teacher, Miss Rodriguez, who was fresh out of college and didn't know me well enough to recognize how much I had changed. The isolation was complete. I had no friends my age because I couldn't relate to their innocent concerns about homework and playground drama. I couldn't confide in adults because Robert and Tyler had successfully convinced me that no one would believe me, and that speaking up would destroy Mom's happiness. I couldn't even trust my own perceptions anymore, because they had gaslit me so thoroughly that I sometimes wondered if I was imagining things or overreacting to normal family affection. The tipping point came on a February evening when Mom was working a double shift at the hospital. There had been a major car accident, and she called to say she wouldn't be home until the next morning. Robert hung up the phone with a smile that made my blood run cold. "Looks like we have the whole night to ourselves," he said, looking between Tyler and me with an expression I had learned to fear. "Tyler, why don't you get the camera ready?" I think it's time Sarah learned some new lessons about being part of this family. That night, they crossed lines that should never be crossed. They documented things that should never be documented. They forced me to participate in acts that stripped away whatever remained of my childhood innocence. And through it all, they reminded me that this was what families did, that this was normal, that I was lucky to have stepfather and stepbrother who cared enough to teach me these important life skills. When it was over, I lay curled on my bedroom floor, staring at the wall and feeling like my soul had been scraped out with a rusty spoon. I couldn't cry anymore. I had used up all my tears months ago. I couldn't scream because they had conditioned me to stay silent. I couldn't fight because they had broken my spirit so completely that resistance felt impossible. But something had shifted that night. In the aftermath of their most brutal assault, a tiny spark of rage began to flicker in the hollow space where my self-worth used to live. It wasn't hope. Hope was too fragile for what I was feeling. It was something harder, more primal. It was the recognition that if I was going to survive this, I couldn't keep waiting for someone else to save me. Nahitia, bejikomas morbianaho. I began to pay attention differently. Instead of dissociating during the abuse, I started memorizing details. I noted when Robert's guard was down, when Tyler got careless with his camera, when Mom's schedule might create opportunities. I started observing the house with new eyes, looking for hiding places, escape routes, evidence that could support my story if I ever found the courage to tell it. The change wasn't dramatic enough for them to notice immediately. I still complied with their demands, still maintained the facade of normalcy during family time, still kept their secrets buried deep inside me. But internally, I was transforming from victim to survivor, from passive recipient of abuse to someone who was beginning to plan her own rescue. I started a journal, hidden inside the cover of my social studies textbook. In it, I recorded dates, times, and details of what they did to me. I wrote down their exact words, their threats, their promises that this was normal, and families who loved each other shared everything. I documented the lies they told Mom about where we had been and what we had done. I created a record that they didn't know existed. I also began to study my mother more carefully. I watched for signs that she might be more aware than she let on, for cracks in her willful blindness that I might be able to exploit. I started paying attention to her schedule, her moods, her relationship with Robert, looking for the right moment and the right approach to finally tell her the truth. Because I had come to a terrible realization, if I didn't find a way to escape this situation soon, it was going to kill me. Not physically, necessarily, though that was a possibility, but it was killing the person I was supposed to become, poisoning my ability to trust, to love, to believe in my own worth. Every day I stayed silent was another day I lost pieces of myself that might never be recovered. I was 12 years old, and I was planning my own rescue mission. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know if anyone would believe me. I didn't know if the truth would destroy our family or set me free. But I knew I couldn't survive much more of their version of love. The little girl who had wanted nothing more than to make her mother happy was still inside me somewhere. But she was sharing space now with someone harder, someone angrier, someone who had learned that sometimes loving someone means being willing to break their heart to save your own life. The question was, would I find the courage to act before they broke me completely? Spring arrived early that year, melting the snow and revealing the dead grass underneath. As the world outside began to show signs of renewal, I was quietly preparing for what I knew would be the most dangerous gamble of my life, telling my mother the truth about what was happening in our house. My 13th birthday came and went with the usual family celebration. Mom baked a chocolate cake from scratch, Robert gave me a jewelry box with a tiny ballerina that spun to music, and Tyler presented me with a photo album for all our family memories. The irony of that gift was lost on everyone but me. As I blew out the candles, I made a silent wish, not for happiness or presents or typical teenage dreams, but for courage. The journal I had been keeping for months was now thick with entries, hidden in a waterproof bag inside the old heating vent in my bedroom wall. I had documented everything with the methodical precision of someone who understood that words might be my only weapons. Dates, times, locations, exact quotes, physical evidence. I had even managed to secretly photograph some of Tyler's camera equipment and the locks Robert had installed on the basement doors. But evidence was only part of my plan. The harder challenge was finding the right moment and the right approach to tell Mom. I had studied her patterns for months, noting when she was most relaxed, most receptive, most likely to listen without immediately shutting down. I had practiced different versions of the conversation in my head, trying to find words that would break through her defensive walls without sending her into complete denial. The opportunity I had been waiting for came in late April. Robert had been called away for a 3-day training conference in Kansas City, and Tyler was going on a school trip to Washington, D.C. that same weekend. For the first time in over a year, Mom and I would be completely alone in the house for multiple days. I spent the week before their departure in a state of nervous anticipation that bordered on panic. This was my chance. Maybe my only chance. But the stakes couldn't be higher. If Mom didn't believe me, if she chose them over me, I would be trapped with 2 men who would know I had tried to expose them. The consequences of failure were too terrifying to contemplate. Friday afternoon, I watched Robert's truck disappear down Maple Street, followed an hour later by the school bus taking Tyler to D.C. Mom was working a day shift and wouldn't be home until evening. I spent those hours rehearsing my approach one final time, pulling my journal from its hiding place, and reading through the entries that chronicled my descent into hell. When Mom's car pulled into the driveway at 6:30 p.m., I was sitting at the kitchen table with homework spread out in front of me, trying to look normal while my heart hammered against my ribs. She came in looking tired but happy, chatting about her day as she started preparing dinner. "Isn't it nice to have the house to ourselves for a change?" she said, pulling ingredients from the refrigerator. "We should have a girls' weekend, maybe watch some movies, do our nails." When was the last time we had quality mother-daughter time? The casual way she said it broke something inside me. When was the last time we had quality time? When was the last time she had really looked at me, really seen me, without the filter of her perfect family fantasy? I couldn't remember. "Mom," I said, my voice coming out smaller than I intended, "can we talk about something important?" She glanced over at me while chopping vegetables. "Of course, sweetie. What's on your mind? Boy troubles? Problems at school?" I took a deep breath, feeling like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. "It's about Robert and Tyler." The knife in her hand paused for just a moment before continuing its rhythmic chopping. "What about them?" "Mom, I need you to stop what you're doing and really listen to me. Please." Something in my tone must have gotten through to her because she set down the knife and turned to face me. For the first time in months, she was giving me her full attention. "Mom, they've been hurting me. Both of them. For a long time." The words hung in the air between us, like a live grenade. Mom's face went through a series of expressions. Confusion, disbelief, something that might have been recognition, then a defensive hardening that made my stomach drop. "Sarah, what do you mean by hurting? If this is about discipline or rules you don't like." "No, Mom, not discipline. They've been touching me inappropriately, making me do things, taking pictures, threatening me if I told anyone." The words were coming faster now, like a dam bursting. "It started not long after we moved here, and it's gotten worse. Much worse." Mom's face had gone completely white. She sat down heavily in the chair across from me, her hands trembling slightly. "Sarah, that's a very serious accusation. Are you sure you're not misunderstanding something? Sometimes affection between family members can feel—" "Mom, please." I pulled my journal from under my homework and placed it on the table between us. "I've been writing everything down. Dates, times, what they said, what they did. I have proof." She stared at the journal like it was a snake that might bite her. "Sarah, why didn't you tell me sooner? If something was really happening, why would you wait so long?" "Because they told me you wouldn't believe me. Because they said it would destroy our family. Because they made me think it was my fault, that I was letting it happen, that telling you would only hurt you more." Tears were streaming down my face now, months of suppressed emotion, finally finding release. "They said you loved them more than me, and if I made you choose, you'd choose them." Mom reached across the table and took my hands in hers. They were ice cold and shaking. "Sarah, honey, that's not true. I love you more than anything in this world. You're my daughter, my baby girl. Nothing could ever change that." But even as she said the words, I could see the war happening behind her eyes. Part of her wanted to believe me, wanted to protect me. But another part was already looking for ways to explain this away, to find an interpretation that wouldn't require her to face the fact that she had invited monsters into our home. "Can I see the journal?" she asked quietly. I slid it across the table to her with trembling hands. This was the moment of truth. Either my documentation would convince her, or it would give her ammunition to dismiss my claims as the fantasies of a troubled teenager. Mom opened the journal and began to read. I watched her face carefully, looking for signs of belief, denial, anger, anything that would tell me how she was processing what she was seeing. Her expression grew more stricken with each page, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she closed the journal and looked up at me. Her eyes were filled with tears. But there was something else there too, something that looked like recognition. "Sarah," she whispered, "some of these dates. I remember these days. I remember Robert saying he was taking you out for special father-daughter time. I remember Tyler offering to help you with homework when I had to work late." Her voice broke. I thought they were being good to you. I thought I was so lucky to have found men who cared about my daughter. The validation I had been desperately seeking for so long finally came, but it brought no relief. Instead, it opened up a chasm of pain that felt bottomless. My mother believed me, but that belief came with the devastating realization that she had been blind to my suffering for over 2 years. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely audible. Mom was quiet for a long time, staring at the journal, her mind clearly racing. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, harder, more determined than I had heard it in years. "Now we get you safe," she said. "And then we make sure they never hurt anyone else again." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt something I had almost forgotten existed: hope. The next 48 hours passed in a blur of phone calls, legal consultations, and careful planning. Mom had transformed overnight from the willfully blind woman who had prioritized her own happiness to a fierce protector determined to make things right. But the process of seeking justice, I quickly learned, was far more complicated than simply telling the truth. Saturday morning, Mom called in sick to work, something she had never done in all the years I could remember. Instead, we drove to the Springfield Police Department, where Detective Linda Hayes, a specialist in crimes against children, listened to our story with professional compassion and growing concern. "What you're describing is a serious pattern of sexual abuse and exploitation," Detective Hayes explained after reviewing my journal and hearing our account. "The coordination between your stepfather and stepbrother makes this particularly complex. We'll need to move carefully to gather evidence and ensure your safety." She explained that with Robert and Tyler both out of town, we had a window of opportunity to collect evidence from the house before they returned. A team of forensic specialists would search the basement workshop, Tyler's room, and any other areas where abuse had occurred. They would look for the cameras, photographs, and any other physical evidence that could support my testimony. "Sarah, I need you to understand that this process might be difficult," Detective Hayes said gently. "You'll need to give detailed statements about what happened to you. There will be interviews, possibly court testimony. These men will likely deny everything and try to discredit your account. Are you prepared for that?" I looked at Mom, who reached over and squeezed my hand. "We're prepared," she said firmly, "whatever it takes." The forensic team arrived at our house Saturday afternoon. Watching strangers methodically document the spaces where I had been violated was surreal and traumatizing, but also validating. They found Robert's hidden cameras in the basement, Tyler's collection of photographs stored on his computer, and physical evidence that corroborated many of the details in my journal. Detective Hayes pulled Mom aside as the search concluded. "Mrs. Henderson, we found enough evidence to arrest both men when they return, but I need to ask, did you ever suspect anything? Were there any signs you noticed but didn't act on?" Mom's face crumpled. "I thought I was doing the right thing," she whispered. "Robert seemed so good to her, so involved in her life. Tyler was just a teenager dealing with his own trauma. I told myself that Sarah was just having normal adjustment issues, that she was being dramatic about typical family dynamics. "This isn't your fault," Detective Hayes said, though I could see in her eyes that she was also evaluating Mom's role in what had happened. Many parents miss the signs. Predators are often very skilled at manipulation. But even as the detective offered absolution, I could see the weight of guilt settling on Mom's shoulders. She would have to live with the knowledge that her desire for a complete family had blinded her to her daughter's suffering for over 2 years. Sunday evening, Robert returned from his conference. Mom met him at the door with a normalcy that amazed me. She asked about his trip, helped him carry in his bags, and suggested he relax while she finished making dinner. I stayed in my room, supposedly doing homework, while she maintained the facade that everything was normal. Tyler returned Monday morning, full of stories about the Washington monuments and the hotel where they had stayed. He seemed genuinely happy and relaxed, probably the longest he had gone without access to me since the abuse began. At breakfast, he actually acted like a normal teenage brother, teasing me about my bedhead and stealing bacon off my plate. It was horrifying how easily they both slipped back into their roles as loving family members. SFD arrests happened Monday afternoon. Mom had taken me to stay with her sister Linda across town so I wouldn't have to witness the confrontation. Detective Hayes later told us that both men had seemed genuinely shocked to be charged. Robert had demanded to speak to his lawyer immediately. Tyler had broken down crying, claiming he didn't understand what was happening. Neither had admitted guilt, but the evidence was overwhelming. The photographs on Tyler's computer, the hidden cameras in the basement, the detailed accounts in my journal that matched physical evidence found in the house. It painted a clear picture of systematic, coordinated abuse. The legal process that followed was grueling. Both men were released on bail while awaiting trial, though they were prohibited from contacting me or coming near our house. Mom hired a lawyer, Susan Martinez, who specialized in representing victims of family abuse. She warned us that the defense would likely try to portray me as a troubled teenager, making false accusations, possibly coached by a bitter mother seeking revenge in a custody dispute. "They'll say Sarah was angry about the divorce proceedings and wanted to hurt Robert," Susan explained during one of our preparation meetings. "They'll suggest she manipulated evidence, made up stories, and convinced you to go along with it. We need to be prepared for them to attack both of your credibility." The irony was bitter. There were no divorce proceedings until after I disclosed the abuse. Mom had been completely happy in her marriage to Robert. If anything, the defense's narrative got it backwards. As we prepared for trial, I began to understand the broader implications of what had happened to our family. Mom had to quit her job at the hospital because the stress and court appearances made it impossible to maintain her schedule. We had to move out of the house on Maple Street because we couldn't afford the rent without Robert's income, and because the memories made it impossible for either of us to feel safe there. Most painfully, I watched Mom grapple with guilt that threatened to consume her. She blamed herself for bringing Robert into our lives, for missing the signs of abuse, for prioritizing her own happiness over my safety. She started seeing a therapist, Dr. Rachel Kim, who specialized in helping family members of abuse survivors. "Secondary trauma is real," Dr. Kim explained to me during one of our joint sessions. "Your mother is dealing with her own set of injuries from this experience. Guilt, betrayal, the shattering of her worldview. Healing is going to be a process for both of you." The trial was scheduled for the following spring, nearly a year after my disclosure. In the meantime, both Robert and Tyler continued to maintain their innocence publicly, while their lawyers worked to discredit my account. Robert gave interviews to local media claiming he was the victim of false accusations by a vengeful ex-wife and her troubled stepdaughter. Tyler's lawyer argued that he was just a confused teenager who had been manipulated by an older man and was now being scapegoated. But as the trial date approached, cracks began to appear in their united front. Tyler's lawyer approached the prosecution with a potential plea deal, reduced charges in exchange for testimony against Robert. It seemed that when faced with the possibility of spending decades in prison, the stepbrother who had once terrorized me was willing to admit that the stepfather who had coordinated our abuse was the primary architect of my suffering. The decision of whether to accept Tyler's plea deal would ultimately be mine. Detective Hayes and Susan Martinez presented me with the options. We could proceed to trial against both men, risking the possibility that a jury might not convict either one, or we could accept Tyler's cooperation to ensure that Robert, the adult who had initiated and orchestrated the abuse, would face justice. It was an impossible choice. Part of me wanted both of them to face the full consequences of what they had done to me. But another part recognized that Tyler had also been under Robert's influence, that he had been groomed and manipulated just as I had been, albeit in a different way. As I sat in Susan Martinez's office, weighing a decision that would determine the course of justice for my case, I realized that this was what healing looked like in the real world. It wasn't clean or complete or satisfying. It was messy and complicated and full of compromises that no child should ever have to make. But it was also empowering in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time in my life, adults were asking me what I wanted to happen. My voice, my choices, my healing were being centered in a process that would determine not just my future, but the futures of the men who had tried to destroy me. I was no longer just a victim. I was becoming a survivor with agency over my own story. After weeks of agonizing deliberation, I made the decision to accept Tyler's plea deal. It wasn't forgiveness. I wasn't ready for that, and might never be. But it was strategic thinking that prioritized getting Robert, the adult mastermind, convicted over punishing Tyler to the fullest extent possible. Tyler would plead guilty to reduce charges and testify against Robert in exchange for a lighter sentence that would still include prison time and mandatory registration as a sex offender. The decision split our small circle of supporters. Aunt Linda thought I was being too lenient with Tyler, arguing that he was old enough to know right from wrong and had actively participated in my abuse. Susan Martinez, our lawyer, believed it was the right strategic choice to ensure Robert's conviction. Mom supported whatever decision I made, though I could see the internal conflict in her eyes. Tyler had been her stepson too, and despite everything, some part of her still saw him as another damaged child caught in Robert's web. Tyler's testimony preparation sessions were surreal. I had to sit in the same room as someone who had terrorized me for years, listening as he described in clinical detail how Robert had initiated him into abusing me, how they had coordinated their actions, and how Robert had convinced him this was normal family behavior. His lawyers had clearly coached him extensively, but there were moments when genuine emotion broke through his rehearsed responses. He told me that this was how fathers taught sons to be men, Tyler said during one session, his voice barely audible. He said that in our family, we shared everything, and that including Sarah. He made it seem like if I didn't participate, I wasn't really his son. Detective Hayes, who was present during these sessions, pressed him for more details. Did Robert threaten you if you refused to participate? Tyler's hands shook as he answered. He never had to threaten me directly. He had this way of making you understand that your place in the family depended on going along with whatever he wanted. And after my mom died, I couldn't lose another family. Listening to Tyler's testimony helped me understand something I had struggled with for months. How he had been both perpetrator and victim, manipulated by Robert while simultaneously choosing to abuse me. It didn't excuse what he had done, but it provided context that made his actions comprehensible in a way they hadn't been before. The trial began in March, exactly 1 year after my disclosure to Mom. Robert had hired an expensive defense team that immediately went on the offensive, painting me as a disturbed teenager with a history of behavioral problems who had fabricated elaborate lies to destroy her stepfather. They presented a carefully constructed narrative that portrayed Robert as a devoted family man who had tried his best to help a difficult child, only to be rewarded with false accusations. But Tyler's testimony demolished their defense strategy. When he took the stand and described in detail how Robert had orchestrated our abuse, providing specifics that corroborated evidence already presented to the jury, the defense team's alternative narrative crumbled. Tyler wasn't a troubled teenager making up stories. He was an accomplice providing insider knowledge of a systematic pattern of abuse. Mr. Henderson told me that teaching Sarah about sexuality was part of my responsibility as her big brother, Tyler testified on his second day on the stand. He said that families who really loved each other didn't have the same boundaries as other families, and that keeping secrets was how we showed our loyalty to each other. Robert's lawyer tried to discredit Tyler during cross-examination, arguing that he was only testifying to reduce his own sentence and couldn't be trusted. But the physical evidence, the cameras, the photographs, the detailed entries in my journal that matched Tyler's account, supported every major element of his testimony. When it came time for me to testify, I was terrified but determined. I had spent months working with Dr. Sarah Chen, a trauma therapist who specialized in helping abuse survivors prepare for court testimony. We had practiced techniques for staying grounded when discussing traumatic memories, strategies for maintaining my composure under aggressive cross-examination, and ways to connect with the jury while telling my story. Taking the stand was one of the hardest things I had ever done. Looking out at the courtroom filled with strangers who would judge the most painful experiences of my life felt like being stripped naked in public. But when I saw Mom in the front row, her eyes filled with love and support, I found the strength to tell my truth. I testified for 2 days, walking the jury through my journal entries, explaining how the abuse had escalated over time, and describing the sophisticated manipulation tactics that Robert and Tyler had used to ensure my silence. Robert's defense team tried to rattle me with aggressive questioning about why I hadn't told anyone sooner, whether I had ever enjoyed any of the attention I received, and whether I was sure I hadn't misinterpreted normal family affection as something inappropriate. But I was ready for their attacks. Dr. Chen had prepared me for every possible line of questioning, and Susan Martinez objected frequently to keep the defense from going too far in their victim-blaming tactics. Most importantly, I had the confidence that comes from knowing you're telling the truth and having evidence to support every claim you make. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Those 72 hours felt like the longest of my life. We waited at Aunt Linda's house, trying to maintain normal routines while constantly checking our phones for updates from the courthouse. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate on anything except the knowledge that 12 strangers were deciding whether to believe my story or Robert's. When the call finally came, Susan Martinez's voice was carefully controlled. "We have a verdict. They want everyone back in the courtroom in an hour." The walk back into that courtroom was surreal. Robert sat at the defendant's table looking confident, as if he believed his expensive lawyers had convinced the jury of his innocence. His eyes met mine briefly as I took my seat, and for a moment I saw a flash of the predatory calculation that had terrorized me for years. But when the jury foreman stood to read the verdict, that confidence evaporated. On the charge of aggravated sexual assault in the first degree, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of sexual exploitation of a minor, we find the defendant guilty. On the charge of conspiracy to commit sexual abuse, we find the defendant guilty. Guilty on all counts. 17 separate charges, 17 guilty verdicts. The maximum sentence would be 45 years in prison. I felt Mom's hand grip mine as the verdicts were read, felt her body shaking with sobs of relief and vindication. Around us, I could hear Aunt Linda crying, could see Susan Martinez smiling for the first time since I had met her. But all I felt was a strange sense of emptiness, as if some essential part of me that had been holding its breath for years had finally exhaled. Justice, I realized, didn't feel the way I had expected it to. It wasn't triumphant or healing or transformative in any dramatic way. It was simply finished. The man who had orchestrated my abuse would spend the rest of his life in prison. Tyler would serve 8 years and be required to register as a sex offender for the rest of his life. The legal system had acknowledged that what happened to me was real, was criminal, and deserved punishment. But my real healing would happen outside that courtroom, in therapy sessions and quiet conversations with Mom, in learning to trust again and building a life that wasn't defined by what had been done to me. At sentencing 2 months later, I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. I had written and rewritten it dozens of times, trying to find words that could adequately express how Robert's actions had affected my life. In the end, I kept it simple. You tried to convince me that what you did was normal, that it was love, that it was what families do, I said, looking directly at Robert as he sat in shackles at the defendant's table. But I know now that love doesn't hurt. Love doesn't require secrets. Love doesn't steal childhood or break trust or use fear as a weapon. What you did wasn't love. It was evil. And while you'll spend the rest of your life in prison, I'll spend the rest of mine learning how to be free. The judge sentenced Robert to the maximum penalty allowed under law. As the bailiff led him away in chains, he turned back to look at me one last time. I met his eyes without flinching, without fear, without the submission he had conditioned me to show. For the first time in my relationship with Robert Henderson, I had the last word. 15 years have passed since that courtroom victory, and I'm sharing this story today as Sarah Williams. I changed my last name when I turned 18, shedding the final connection to the Henderson family that had caused so much pain. I'm 28 now, married to a wonderful man named David who knows my entire history and loves me not despite my past but including it. We have a daughter, Emma, who just turned 5, and watching her grow up fearless and trusting has taught me things about healing that no therapy session ever could. But getting to this point, to genuine happiness, healthy relationships, and peace with my past, took years of intentional work that began the moment Robert's prison transport van disappeared from the courthouse parking lot. The first challenge was learning how to live without the hypervigilance that had kept me alive during years of abuse. For months after the trial, I would wake up in panic, forgetting for a moment that Robert and Tyler were gone. I would check locks obsessively, avoid being alone with adult men, and interpret innocent gestures as potential threats. My nervous system had been programmed for danger, and reprogramming it required patience and professional help. Dr. Chen became my anchor during this transition. Through trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, EMDR sessions, and eventually group therapy with other survivors, I slowly learned to distinguish between past threats and present safety. The process wasn't linear. There were setbacks, flashbacks, and moments when I felt like I was drowning in memories that refused to stay buried. Healing from complex trauma isn't about forgetting what happened, Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. It's about changing your relationship to those memories so they no longer control your present. One of the most difficult aspects of recovery was rebuilding my relationship with Mom. While I never blamed her for the abuse itself, that responsibility belonged entirely to Robert and Tyler. I struggled with resentment over the years she hadn't seen my suffering. She carried enormous guilt, which sometimes made her overprotective in ways that felt suffocating to a teenager trying to develop independence. We attended family therapy together for over 2 years, working through the complex emotions surrounding her role in my abuse. Mom had to confront not just her guilt, but the societal conditioning that had taught her to prioritize keeping a man happy over protecting her daughter. I had to learn to separate the mother who had failed to protect me from the mother who had ultimately believed me and fought for justice. "I can't change the years I was blind," Mom said during one particularly emotional session. "But I can spend the rest of my life making sure you know that you matter more to me than any man, any marriage, any fantasy of a perfect family. You are my perfect family, Sarah. You always were." That conversation marked a turning point in our relationship. We began to build something new, not a recreation of what we'd had before Robert entered our lives, but an adult relationship based on honesty, mutual respect, and shared commitment to healing. Academically, I had missed significant portions of my education due to the trauma's impact on my concentration and attendance. But with tutoring and accommodations for my PTSD symptoms, I not only graduated high school on time but earned a scholarship to study social work at Missouri State University. My experiences had given me insight into the child welfare system that I wanted to use to help other kids in similar situations. College was where I first began to see my survival not as something to be ashamed of, but as a source of strength that could serve others. I volunteered at a crisis hotline for sexual assault survivors, participated in awareness campaigns about family abuse, and eventually became a peer counselor for other students with trauma histories. It was also in college that I met David. He was studying to become a teacher, drawn to working with at-risk youth. Our first conversation was about the books we were reading for a psychology class, but something about his gentle manner and genuine curiosity about people's stories made me feel safe in a way I hadn't experienced with men my age. I was terrified to tell him about my past. Previous dating attempts had ended poorly, when potential boyfriends either couldn't handle the reality of my trauma, or, worse, saw me as damaged goods. But David listened to my story with compassion rather than pity, anger at my abusers rather than discomfort with me, and curiosity about my healing, rather than focus on my wounds. "You're not broken," he said after I finished telling him everything. "You're one of the strongest people I've ever met. What happened to you was horrible. But what you did with it, surviving, seeking justice, helping others, that's extraordinary." Our relationship developed slowly, with David following my lead on physical intimacy and emotional vulnerability. He attended therapy sessions with me when I asked, learned about trauma responses so he could better support me during difficult times, and never made me feel like my healing was an inconvenience or my triggers were his burden to fix. We married when I was 25 in a small ceremony attended by the family of choice I had built: Mom, Aunt Linda, Dr. Chen, Susan Martinez, and friends who had become sisters. There were no fathers to walk me down the aisle, no patriarchal traditions that might trigger memories of male authority being misused. Instead, Mom and I walked together toward a future that felt genuinely hopeful. When Emma was born 2 years later, I faced new challenges around parenting from a place of trauma history. Every decision about her safety, her relationships with adults, her understanding of bodily autonomy was filtered through my determination that she would never experience what I had endured. David and I attended parenting classes specifically designed for trauma survivors, learning how to raise a child who would be both protected and empowered. Watching Emma grow up fearless and secure has been profoundly healing. When she climbs onto David's lap for bedtime stories, when she hugs her uncles and male teachers without hesitation, when she speaks up confidently about what she wants and doesn't want, I see what childhood is supposed to look like. Her innocence isn't naive. We've taught her age-appropriate lessons about body safety and trusting her instincts, but it's genuine and unmarked by the shadows that defined my early years. Today I work as a family advocate for Child Protective Services, helping investigate cases of abuse and supporting families through the legal process. It's emotionally demanding work, but also deeply meaningful. I can spot the signs that other adults miss, connect with traumatized children in ways that my colleagues sometimes can't, and provide families with hope based on my own experience of surviving and thriving. I also speak publicly about childhood sexual abuse, particularly the complex dynamics that exist when abuse occurs within families. Too many people still believe that abuse committed by relatives is somehow less serious than stranger danger, or that children should be able to easily disclose what's happening to them. My story challenges those misconceptions and provides a roadmap for how communities can better protect vulnerable children. Mom and I have both become advocates in our own ways. She volunteers with an organization that educates parents about recognizing signs of abuse, and she's never hesitated to share her own story about the blindness that nearly cost her daughter everything. Her willingness to acknowledge her mistakes publicly has helped other parents recognize warning signs they might otherwise rationalize away. The ripple effects of speaking our truth have been remarkable. Over the years, dozens of survivors have reached out to share their own stories, many mentioning that our case gave them courage to report their own abuse or seek help for trauma they had carried in silence. Several mothers have told me that hearing about Mom's experience helped them believe their children's disclosures when they might have otherwise dismissed them. Robert died in prison 3 years ago, a heart attack that no one mourned. Tyler was released after serving his full 8-year sentence. I've heard through various channels that he struggles with addiction and has had difficulty maintaining employment due to his sex offender status. I feel no satisfaction in his suffering, but I also feel no obligation to forgive him or wish him well. Some wounds don't require forgiveness to heal. As I finish sharing this story, I want to be clear about something. I'm not grateful for what happened to me. I wouldn't wish this experience on anyone, and I refuse to pretend that trauma is a gift or that suffering is necessary for strength. But I am grateful for what I did with what happened to me. I'm grateful that I found my voice before it was too late. I'm grateful that my mother chose to believe me and fight for me. I'm grateful for every therapist, lawyer, detective, and advocate who helped me reclaim my life. I'm grateful for David's love and Emma's laughter and the family we've built together. Most of all, I'm grateful to be alive and free and powerful enough to use my story to help others find their own path to healing. If you're watching this and you're carrying secrets that are hurting you, please know that you deserve to be believed, you deserve to be protected, and you deserve to heal. If you're a parent watching this, please know that your first job is always to protect your children, even when that protection comes at personal cost. And if you're a survivor like me, Please know that your story matters, your voice has power, and your future can be beautiful in ways that your past never was. We are stronger than what tried to break us. We are braver than we know. And we are worthy of love, safety, and every good thing that life has to offer. This is Sarah Williams, survivor and thriver, signing off. Thank you for listening to my story, and remember, you are not alone. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.